So one of the things that becomes really immediately apparent if you've spent any amount of time in church is that things aren't always as they should be. Churches are made up of people like you and me, people of the same nature. And at times Satan is allowed to attack even the church, and even sometimes and often through the people that we know as brothers and sisters. It's at times heartbreaking and confusing, and it can even test our faith when those that we love, when those in the church betray us. Our passage today deals with what I think we can say is the greatest betrayal in the history of mankind. And I think that as we consider this event from God's Word and see the way that God uses even that for His glory and for our good, I believe that's going to arm us with what we need to understand. Arm us with the picture of God's sovereign power that works even through such things as betrayal from those we love. And it arms us with that so that we can cling to Christ even when it seems that Satan wins the day, even in the church. So go ahead and turn with me to John chapter 13. We saw the first portion of this chapter last week. And as we saw in last week in the book of John, starting here in chapter 13, Jesus' public ministry is finished. And it is as though in the book time stops for several chapters, and we zoom into one short span of time in one single location for what's known as the Upper Room Discourse. And again, these are the really last few hours that Jesus spends with His disciples before His betrayal, before He's handed over to be crucified. So last week we witnessed in this upper room the incredible, pride-destroying, humble love of Christ as He, the King of all creation, lowered Himself as a servant to His sinful disciples, even in the middle of their sinning and in the middle of their prideful bickering. Christ served them. And we saw how through that we understand that He serves us in our sin as well. That He never grows tired of washing us, of keeping us, even though our flesh is continually at war against the Spirit. And so this morning, as we return to Jesus and His disciples reclining around the table in this upper room, Jesus is going to continue loving and comforting His disciples in these last moments before He's taken to the cross. So as we go together today to this upper room, we'll see Jesus identify the one who would betray Him, and then comfort His disciples by showing them the glorious outcome of even His betrayal. So again, we're in John chapter 13, and let's start reading at verse 21, and we're going to pause at verse 30 and talk about it. But let's hear the word of the Lord together this morning. John 13, starting in verse 21. When Jesus had said this, He became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, that one of you will betray me." The disciples began looking at one another, at a loss to know of which one He was speaking. There was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of His disciples, whom Jesus loved. So Simon Peter gestured to Him and said, "Tell us who it is of whom He's speaking." He, leaning back thus on Jesus' bosom, said to Him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus then answered, "That is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him." So when He had dipped the morsel, He took and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." Now, no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. For some were supposing, because Jesus had the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, "Buy the things we have need of for the feast," or else that he should give something to the poor. So, after receiving the morsel, he went out immediately, and it was night. So immediately, as the passage opens, we're told that Jesus became troubled in spirit for what he was about to tell his disciples. In fact, the news that he was sharing with them was so unbelievable. It says that Jesus testified, which means he formally declared this as though swearing an oath to it, knowing that how this was going to land on his disciples. It would be hard to believe that one of them was going to betray Jesus. Verse 21, when Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." So, of course, the disciples wanted to know who the betrayer was. So Peter asked the disciple whom Jesus loved, which we know is John, the author of this book. Peter asked him to ask Jesus who this betrayer was. And it might seem a little weird to us that it tells us that the disciple was leaning on Jesus' bosom. Now, that's not something you typically see men doing today. But remember, this goes back to the custom of how they ate dinner. Remember, like we heard last week, they didn't sit at tables or in chairs around tables. They reclined at the table. The table was low to the ground and sometimes just a rug, and they would have cushions out that they would recline on. And so typically, a cushion was given for your left arm, and you would lie halfway curled up, and you'd reach your food and eat like that. And so if you're sitting to the right of someone, if you're going to talk to them, you kind of have to lean back and look up at them, basically. And so that's what's happening here. This disciple whom Jesus loved reclining on his bosom, that simply means John was laying right to the right of Jesus. He was eating right next to the Lord. So John asks Jesus, and Jesus gives him a sign. The betrayer is the one that Jesus dips the bread and gives it to. And this sign that Jesus gives to John doesn't come out of nowhere. If you'll remember last week, Jesus, when he began to predict his betrayal in verse 18, he actually quotes Psalm 41:9 to the disciples. So looking back there at verse 18, John 13, he says, "I do not speak of all of you. I know the ones I have chosen, but it is that the scriptures may be fulfilled. He who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me." And so, in direct fulfillment of this prophecy, Jesus hands the bread to his betrayer. And then the passage says, starting middle of verse 26, "So when he had dipped the morsel, he took it and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan entered into him." Now Judas had been with Jesus since the beginning. He had witnessed his miracles. He had heard Christ in his preaching apply the crushing weight of the law to people, and then turn around and proclaim this glorious good news that Christ came to fulfill that law for them, to set them free, to save them from their sins. Judas had heard all of that. He had seen his miracles. He had sat with Jesus even around this table in this upper room. He had witnessed this incredible display of Christ's humility and love and grace as he washed their feet. And he had partaken of the Last Supper in the upper room with Jesus. And yet, Judas was unaffected by all of that. He had hardened his heart toward Jesus. And he had even developed this scheme to make a quick buck by betraying him. But the truth is, as much as that is Judas's fault, it could not have been any other way. The word of God must be fulfilled, that he who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. So after Judas receives Christ's bread, Jesus sends him out to do what Judas had planned to do. He says, therefore Jesus said to him, what you do quickly. I believe we have a great deal to learn from what this passage shows us right here. Even with Jesus signifying his betrayer and sending him out to carry out the plan, and all the disciples just simply didn't get it. Look again at verse 28. Now, no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. For some were supposing, because Jesus had the money box, and Jesus was saying, go buy the things we have need of for the feast, or else that he should give something to the poor. So, if there's one thing we can say about the disciples based on this, that as they followed Christ, they didn't have a critical attitude toward one another's faith. In fact, as both Matthew and Mark show us, all the disciples sat around saying, is it me that's going to betray Jesus? None of them were pointing to the slimy guy sitting over there. Well, of course it's him. They didn't have this critical attitude towards one another. And even if they did, the false brother among them was apparently so well hidden that they wouldn't have been able to spot him. Scripture does indeed reveal that there will be false believers in the church. That's just a reality. But as we're going to see, even they are not outside of the sovereignty of Christ over his church. He accomplishes his will even through them. So not only do we not have to worry about trying to dig out false brethren, Jesus actually explicitly tells us not to do that elsewhere in the Scriptures. Listen to the parable of the tares and the wheat from Matthew 13. Matthew 13, starting at verse 24. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. So the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, an enemy has done this. The slave said to him, do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, no. For while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles and burn them up. But gather the wheat into my barn. And Jesus goes on, starting in verse 36, to explain that the wheat are those who believe, and that the tares are those in the kingdom, in our churches, who are in reality sons of Satan, to use Jesus' language. But in the parable, he says, no, you don't try to gather up the tares, because you're going to pull up the wheat with them. Jesus knows we are absolutely terrible judges of people. And the truth is, we are all of the same nature. We all sin. We all have moments of weakness and seasons where our spirits are dull. And it's just not, we're not on fire. We almost probably rather not go to church. That's the nature of our flesh. It is at war with the Spirit, but the flesh is still there. And so if we took it upon ourselves to decide who is and isn't in the kingdom on the basis of what we can see, every one of us would condemn each other at one point or another. And Jesus knows this very well. That's why he says, don't do it. That's not your job. We cannot see one another's hearts. Unlike Jesus. And unlike Jesus, we don't know all things. But consider this. Jesus does know all things. He knew exactly who Judas was right from the beginning, before he called him to his church. And yet he called him. And he taught him. And he displayed every act of kindness that the others received. He displayed it to Judas as well. And he did so because in the mysterious will and plan of God, he had a purpose for Judas. That such purposes aren't for us to know in the here and now, but Christ has them. And that purpose is what we're going to see next in the passage. Look with me, starting in verse 31. It says, "Therefore, when he had gone out, Jesus said, 'Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come.'" So verse 31 there is what ties Judas's betrayal to Christ's purpose. Christ reveals that this betrayal is serving a purpose. And perhaps the most important purpose there is. It says, when he had gone out, when Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." So, even with Judas going out to perform his treachery, that is what sets in motion the glorification of the Son of God through that evil act. All of the horrific events that were to follow this moment, leading to Christ's death, that place where he was going where the disciples could not come, as Jesus just mentioned to them. All of this was set in motion through the agency of this false brother. And these horrific events were no less than the very reason Jesus came. All the injustice he was about to experience, through all of that injustice, the glory of God would be displayed to the fullest. Since Jesus is fully God and fully man, two distinct natures combined into one person. As Jesus suffered, God suffered. And everything that Jesus went through displayed the glory of his Father, because they are one and the same. Distinct persons, yet one God. What Jesus does, the Father does. That's one message that John makes again and again. So Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." Without going into a whole long Greek lesson, the word for glorified here is a passive verb. So through the events that were converging on Jesus, through Judas beginning it, and through his obedience to walk through these things that were coming upon him, his glory would be displayed. This is what theologians call the passive obedience of Christ. His willingness to suffer what God had planned and what Judas had set in motion. He walks without sin through this event that God had orchestrated that was the reason the world was created. And through that passive obedience of Christ, through him obediently suffering what was coming upon him, the very heart and the intentions of God towards his creation would be put on perfect, blazingly clear display for all the world to see. God's perfect goodness, his kindness, his grace and love, and his perfect severity towards unrighteousness. All of that is revealed in the cross of Christ. God is glorified at the cross. Nothing but the death of the sinless Son of God in our place for our sins could display God's perfect condemnation of sin. At the cross, as Jesus is raised up to the sky for all the world to look at him and to behold, and he's broken, and he's bleeding, and he's forsaken by the Father, not for any sin of his own, but as our substitute. And as his life's blood is drained from him, we see death put on display in the one man that didn't deserve it. And as he dies, we see the penalty that God's law prescribes to all sin, and that is death. And we understand that as Christ hung on that cross, he made a full satisfaction for the justice of God that we deserve. He paid it in full. All of the wrath of God towards sin was satisfied upon that bleeding, dying, sinless man on that cross. But as clearly as God's severity, his severity towards sin, is displayed in the death of Christ, so also God could give no clearer picture of his redeeming love than in that same cross. Through Jesus' sacrifice, he established himself as the Savior of the world, the only mediator between God and man. And his sacrifice is not some distant, irrelevant event 2,000 years ago. As he was nailed to that cross, bearing your sin and mine, you were nailed to that cross with him. Personally, his death was for you. God has pronounced a curse upon all sinners. And in the death of Christ for you, that curse is satisfied. For you. And the Scriptures declare that there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ. That's you. Because of your union with Christ through faith, you are free. The perfect life of Christ, his perfect obedience, his perfect record of keeping God's law is counted as though it were yours in him. And the death of Christ is counted as a full satisfaction for your sins. Past, present, and future. And the resurrection of Jesus is your life. Because he lives forever, you live forever in him. And even now, with Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father, he is there pleading your case with his own blood, praying for you, keeping you through his sovereign power, because that which he purchased, he will have forever. And one day he will return to make all things new. And it pleases the Father to give you that new creation in Christ. We will reign with him, the Scripture says. All of that displays the glory of God, all coming through the cross, all coming through the false brother betraying him. So after telling them in verse 31, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified him, Jesus says in the very next verse, verse 32, if God is glorified in him, in Jesus, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him immediately. This declaration that Jesus makes here points to one of the most amazing truths in all of Scripture, in all of reality. Something new, something brand new that had never happened, happens at the resurrection and the ascension of Christ to the Father. As a result of Jesus' obedience to the death, God glorifies him. So just to avoid any confusion here, God the Son has always, from eternity past, possessed the fullness of the divine nature. The glory of the Father and the Son and the Spirit are equal. In fact, they're the same glory. It's the glory of God shared by the entire Godhead. And as we're going to see Jesus pray in chapter 13, Jesus says, now, Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. So God the Son has always possessed the fullness of the glory of God. But yet there is something new happening here. Something amazing is happening that Jesus is declaring in this passage, that because he's glorifying God at the cross, God's going to glorify him. There's something new and amazing that had never happened before. And that is this. God the Son had taken on flesh. The divine nature was joined with human nature eternally when Jesus was born in that manger. And Jesus glorified God in his flesh during his life. And as a result, for the first time, flesh and blood was going to be glorified with the very glory of God. Never before could a living, breathing, true and full human being be said to have the glory of God. This was new. Adam, through his sin, fell short of the glory of God. And all of us in Adam fall short of the glory of God. But now, through Christ's obedience, he gained what Adam fell short of. He gained what you and I have fallen short of. He gained the glory of God. And here's the good news. He gained it for us. Since we are one with him through faith, united to him. Listen to the word of God. This is Hebrews 2, starting at verse 9. It says, but we do see him who was made for a little while lower than angels. That's Jesus. Namely Jesus. Because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, for all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. In Adam, we fall short of the glory of God. In Christ, we are brought to the glory of God forever. The God-man, Jesus Christ, gained the glory of God where we've fallen short of it. And because of the free grace, gift of his grace held out to us in the gospel, we share in that glory at our resurrection. And for all of eternity, we will be glorified with him in the new heavens and earth. So what does this mean for us here and now? Since God has used such satanic, treachery as Judas's betrayal to accomplish such an unspeakable gift. Where does that leave us? Now that we've been set free in Christ, what do? Look with me, verses 34, 35, our last two verses. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So Jesus says that he's giving a new commandment to his disciples. If you understand what it is that God has always required in his law of human beings, you might be asking, wasn't it always commanded that we love our neighbor as ourselves? Isn't that kind of the second part of the law, that we love our neighbor? And yeah, it is. So what's new about Jesus' new commandment he's giving? We get a huge clue as to what's new about it in verse 34. Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you. That you also love one another. So the call to love one another is not new. What's new is that in Christ, we now fully understand the glory, the mystery of God's redemption. Planned from before the world was. God's plan to redeem sinners in Christ goes all the way back to the covenant between the Father and the Son before the world was ever made. And we got small glimpses of that plan of redemption through the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament. We see shadows, we see types, we see the promises, and we see all the various details pointing us towards God's redemption that would come in Christ. But it was hidden until Jesus himself came and revealed it to us. That which was present in shadows in the Old Testament bursts forth in brilliant clarity as Christ arrives on the scene and establishes the new covenant, which we are a part of today. So now that the mystery of Christ has been revealed, has been made plain to the world, and we understand the love of God for us in Christ, and now that He's called us and shaped us and joined us together into church bodies, where we gather together to hear and see and taste and remember the glory of that mystery of God's love in Christ, we're equipped to love one another in a way that is brand new. It was unforeseen until these realities unfolded. We in the church can love in a way that none other were ever able to before Christ. As John said in 1 John 4:19, we love because He first loved us. And that's how love in the church works. He loves us first. We receive His love in the church. And that produces love in us that we then show one another. It never mixes, it never gets flipped around. That's always the order of it. We receive the gift in Christ. That produces the love. And the love that exists among the church, again, is something utterly unique to the new covenant people of God. A group joined together around that gospel, men and women receiving the unchanging love of Christ, and then loving one another out of that love. It's new. In fact, such love is so certain when a church is rightly being clear on the gospel, on the law and the gospel, when it's clear in a church, that love is so certain that Jesus says in verse 35, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And just to point out, like we heard last week, this is not something you whip up in your own power. We can't do that. This kind of love isn't because you discipline yourself enough to love. It doesn't work that way. This love is a fruit. This love is produced like fruit on a vine as we are attached to Christ the head. Christ the vine. So as we dwell in the love of Christ for us as a body, the love of Christ grows in us as a body. And the result of that is that the love of Christ will come through us to one another. So taking a step back and looking again at the whole sweep of this passage, we understand Jesus was not surprised by Judas' betrayal. In fact, if you listened last week, he mentioned it several times. He hinted at it. He got really clear with it this week, but he had been hinting about his betrayal before. Jesus was not surprised. And he had spent the last 3 years loving Judas, including him in every gracious display of his mercy and his love. He spent that time teaching him the truth, walking with him through all that had come to pass. And Judas, for his part, followed and even participated. Judas was loved by Christ. And he was suspected by none of the disciples. Yet he was an impostor. He was driven by the lusts of his flesh to do the unthinkable, because he had not believed in Christ. And yet Christ had him there for a reason. It was through the free actions of the son of perdition, as Jesus will call him in chapter 17, that the ultimate display of the glory of God was set in motion. So if God could bring the greatest gift that's ever been given through the greatest act of treachery that's ever been committed, how much more can we trust Christ to care for his body today, now? Leave it in his hands and just love one another according to his command. Whether it's tares or wheat or whatever, Christ has forbidden us to burden ourselves with sniffing out everyone's profession of faith within the local body of baptized believers. All of these things are in his hands. If Christ sees fit, he will reveal hypocrisy if it's there, if he sees fit. And we should pray that we would obediently address that however it needs to be when the time comes. But until and if he does, we go on receiving Christ's love and loving one another as he has loved us.